Thank you for joining. Those of you who have joined, this is 2021's version of our free webinar series. What we've attempted to do during much of COVID was figure out innovative ideas or intellectual property that we have developed and bring it to the marketplace in an attempt to be helpful as we're in turbulent times. 2021. Let's ask 2020 to hold its beer while it goes crazy. So 2021 is off to quite a start. If it's at all like 2020 or any year, it'll be less than fully predictable. And we as business leaders will have to make adjustments. Elijah and Claudia and Morgan and folks on our team were thinking about what we could bring in about a 45-minute window today on a webinar, what we could package and bring that might be of help or offer some insights. This topic today is particularly important to me for three reasons, and I hope to you for three reasons. One is the myth of perfection has been around in business, society, families forever. This idea that perfection is somehow even attainable or an expectation. It's been studied by a lot of folks, the negative and sometimes not so negative impacts of myth of perfection. What I thought about and what we published our Forbes article on back in late December was, how does this idea of COVID and remote work or hybrid working clash with the myth of perfection? So the myth of perfection, maybe leaders should be perfect, employees shouldn't make mistakes, we should always hit budget. That's been around for a while. But as we come out of this forced remote work environment situation, and we come back to more of a hybrid working environment, how does that perfection and the effects from remote work and social isolation, how do they collide? And we got to thinking about, this is a real problem that we want to ring the bell for and begin to think about potential solutions or insights for our client. This is particularly important because there is likely never going back to anything other than a hybrid situation. And are leaders prepared? Are organizations prepared? What about the impact of culture and performance and engagement? These are questions that aren't answered yet. One of the things that we've noted as a firm is all over the web, on LinkedIn and Facebook, et cetera, you have Deloitte and McKinsey and all the local, all the local firms, as well as the national and international firms, racing. What does it mean to lead and drive culture and performance in a hybrid environment? And everybody's got their 4 or 5 points, and we'll have 4 or 5 insights as well. But we actually are endeavoring to begin to build a program, and we'll talk about that program later, where my doctoral dissertation was in studying remote work. We have particular IP and research around what it means for leaders, what it means for employee engagement and performance. So at the end of this, I'm going to talk about our program and invite anybody on this webinar to offer a feedback. Just a note, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist by education. Elijah is an HR guy who's transed into executive coaching development. And we have a firm that has been around since 2006, providing leadership development and organizational development services. So a lot of firms like ours are going to bring thinking and possible solutions and insights around this idea of how do we re-enter the sort of what used to be normal and will no longer be normal. I mean, forget COVID even for a moment, forget a lot of the social unrest. Even before that, there was a vast amount of research on millennials entering not only the workforce, but now leadership positions and their expectations for a working environment. When I did my dissertation back in 2007, when I completed it, that is, I did it for a longer time than that. When I completed it, remote work was then called telecommuting, and telecommuting was an innovative approach back in the early 80s and late 80s around enabling more people, more talent to have access to the workplace by not having to be physically located in a set space. That was innovative at the time. Well, now we know remote work being forced upon American and global business culture, we're likely not going back. The millennials coming into the workforce all around the globe, the research around remote work's positive impacts on productivity and satisfactions, as well as some negatives, but we know how to manage that now. It's got a curvilinear relationship, that is time out of the office, with satisfaction and productivity. We know these things now. But today we're going to talk about how the myth of perfection that's always been in business collides with managing in a hybrid working environment. And we're going to offer some thoughts and insights around that. I hope that you all leave here, this webinar, with a couple of insights, a couple of questions, and further research. But to be clear, one of the main insights I'd like you to take away, because we've done a bit of research here, more than a bit, is that the 4 and 5 step plan on Deloitte's website and McKinsey's article and Harvard Business is not the right solution. They're elements of the right solution, but what we're going to find out today is that your customer base, your service and product configuration, and your desired outcome for meaningful work for your employees are really the criteria or variables from which we'll begin to answer the questions about how do we re-enter in a hybrid environment. Let's start with the myth of perfection. Most of you on this call get it right away. The myth of perfection, right? Mark Twain, way back, talked about continuous improvement over delayed perfection. We know about analysis paralysis, and perfect is the enemy of good and all those cliches. But yet in business, there still seems to be this myth of perfection. And I'll use this slide here as an illustration for women and particularly young women in society, right? The popular literature that was selling products, what it was called, Fifth Avenue, right? They continued to put out images of the perfect beauty or the perfect women. And what we know from a psychological standpoint, certainly child psychology, is that when young girls aren't in their own mind measuring up to what this perfection in their society looks like, it can cause anxiety and depression and challenges for development. So I use this just as a societal illustration to say the damage that the myth of perfection can do is not immaterial, it's substantive. Many people talk about young kids in high school today that are studying remotely. What are the deleterious or negative impacts to their grade point average and their social skills, their ability to team and work with others? We might not know this for years, but this idea that I had to have the 4.5 grade point average and this number of AP classes, or I was a loser, I didn't get into the right school. We can look at the myth of perfection societally as it relates to attractiveness or education or the right occupation. What we know is that when we put this thing out called perfection, A, it doesn't exist, and B, we as humans certainly often compare and contrast our own being to what perfect ought to be. And it's quite a dangerous thing to do. And I use this illustration because most of us coming up have seen the illustrations, particularly with beauty and young women, and the damage it can do. I just highlight that to get our head around this idea of the myth of perfection. This concept in business has been around forever, and consciously maybe we'll say, well, we don't expect perfection. But out of awareness or unconsciously, I believe that we've developed a bias toward things will be perfect. We look at A players as people who hit their KPIs and goals all of the time. And you'll actually hear leaders, senior leaders, bargain with themselves, right? So it's usually a male. So Joe is just great, but he doesn't play well with others, or he's really not a great leader, but boy, is he fantastic. And he's an A player except for. And that's not true, right? To be a healthy, collaborative, productive employee and leader, we have some level of emotional intelligence, the ability to collaborate, the ability to share information in a clear and concise way, behave a certain way, adhere to values. These are things that make for a true A player. So this idea that one can be perfect, but except for these interpersonal things we hear all the time, it's a form of bargaining. But what we have noted is that many immature leaders or junior leaders will over-index toward that perfection on the hitting of the goals and the KPIs, except for these other things. Take it away from talent for a moment. When we set a plan in place, the immature planner, the immature leader will, we set the plan, let's hit the plan. Well, we learned from 2019, we learn every year, Murphy's Law is in effect, right? We don't need you as a senior, mature, stable leader when things are working perfectly. We need you when things aren't working perfectly. How many of us have a budgeting process we've been through, sort of bland and dry, and it's a rework of some previous year. Maybe it iterates a little better. But budgeting, an example where we almost never get it perfect, right? How about compensation plans or performance appraisal plans? We know these aren't perfect, but yet when we set them in place, we become surprised when they don't give us the desired outcome or affects it. Sort of, you'll watch the mature and stable leader respond when things aren't perfect versus the immature or unstable leader, less than emotionally intelligent. But there is an out of awareness or unconscious bias that we set a plan in place. We promote that person into the new job. When we hire Kevin, everything's going to be great. Everything's going to be perfect. And when it isn't, we sort of get self-critical or we begin to blame. And so I just want to remind us that this myth of perfection, often we see it, Lucille Ball here, right? Oh my gosh, how did that not work? Oh my gosh, when I hired that person, I thought they were fantastic. What did we miss? What was the mistake? How can we not make that mistake again? Newsflash, you're going to make that mistake again. No budgets are perfect. No plan is perfect. No person is perfect. No team is perfect. We want to begin to challenge this myth of perfection and replace it with a growth mindset and excellence and other things we'll talk about. But I love watching developing leaders react to errors and mistakes. And I love reminding them that that's the reason you're in the position. You're not in the position because the trains run perfectly on time all the time. We need you because things aren't perfect. Things never will be perfect. And when we plan, the mature planner ought to be thinking about the downside, scenario planning, contingencies, risk. I often facilitate strategic planning sessions. We plan for the plan and the upside. No executive team wants to slow down and plan for the downside. Plan for the risk. Map the risk. These are things we can do to negate or push against the myth of perfection and remind leaders that this is in fact what they're existing to do. Excellence is different than perfection. In business, at a very simplified level, what we want to do is create value. Each of us as individuals and as organizations want to create value. We want to do it by maximizing our effort. We want to burn less TCAL, total cost of labor. We want to bring down our cost and produce more. This is a very basic fundamental, right? So isn't our job to think about value creation at some cost rather than planning for some perfection? So this idea that, okay, the myth of perfection in business is quite strong. We built a plan. We're going to go get this market. We've hired this team and leader over in Europe, and they're going to go do great things. How often do we plan for things not going right? The risk, the downside. How well do we map it, weight it, put contingencies around it? This is the idea that we know as senior developed people, things aren't perfect. But now, as we go back into the world of work, how will this myth of perfection dissipate? I really do hope that this myth of perfection is something that we're not talking about 5-10 years from now, is developing thinkers in organizational behavior and leadership. I really want us to think about the work environment as a place to truly innovate. The work environment as a place to truly innovate so that we avoid that surprise and shock when things don't go right. I think the axiom for the 2021 in our firm and for me is things are going to go wrong. How can we see around corners and plan for that? And when we can't plan for that, how can we react with resilience? Things will go wrong. How do we react with resilience? This is the competence or the skill that we want to build. When we think about the future of work, I reference this MIT Sloan Management chart. When I think about the future of work, I think about everything starts with your customers. We have customers, you have customers, people who receive the value you create. How do we produce and satisfy and engage our customers? How do we acquire them? How about value? How do we create value? And how do we find value in marketplaces that we're not serving today? And then finally, how do we create meaningfulness of work? If you want good entertainment, follow Tom Peters. Tom Peters, the legendary management guru, on Twitter. He's hypercritical of this idea of financial value and meaningfulness or impact being out of whack. He believes very, very strongly, if you follow him, that starting with an impact for customers and employees, and then finding the value creation, rather than you typically think about starting a business or growing an existing small business or large businesses. How do we create value? And oh, by the way, then how do we put plans in place to keep customers and employees engaged? Tom Peters very much challenges us to think about what meaningful impact do we want to create for customers? And then how will we get value from that at what cost? We work backwards. How about for our workforce? We have to think very critically about the lies that have been told by our federal leaders. The Rust Belt has lost manufacturing jobs for decades. Those jobs largely aren't coming back. Our economy has shifted to a service economy, and now it's shifting toward an automation economy. Those jobs aren't coming back. And the lie, the lack of truth that manufacturing will be a leading industry in our culture, in American society, is a lie. It's a myth. Because our leaders lie and create that myth, we're not solving the challenges. How do we get our educational system re-engineered toward a service or an even automated type of economy, without facing the reality of this idyllic, perfect world that we had in the 50s and 60s? Without letting go of that, how can we actually adapt, innovate, and evolve our workforce? How can we create purpose and meaning for large swaths of our country that are disenfranchised? Look at the consequences that are happening literally today. We've disenfranchised a large section of our culture. What about re-education? What about transitioning to a service economy? We even missed that probably. Now, how do we retool toward a gig or an automation economy? What does it even mean? I don't actually have animosity toward the people that are expressing animosity. They've been left behind largely from the labor force standpoint and an education standpoint. I host these webinars because we are an organizational management consulting firm. We want to help organizations evolve. Organizational behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a series of systems: the educational system, the healthcare system, the legal and regulatory systems that we have. I dare say that creating meaning and impact for young people coming out of high school and college, maybe not even college, how do they find meaningful impact in the way they're going to work? Do they have to leave central Wisconsin to go to other parts of our country? I'm not sure that's a sustainable long-term solution. And then finally, from an organizational standpoint, multiple stakeholders. How do we create meaning and impact for multiple stakeholders? We know we want to grow revenue and margin and share and all those things, but how do we automate? What we're finding is that, again, another myth, right? The myth that technology, artificial intelligence, and automation will replace humans. It's largely a myth. There's been really well-written studies by Boston Consulting Group, Harvard, and some of these other organizations that say with technology implementation, we actually create the need for new and different types of employment. Not much moves away. Many of you on this webinar who have done a SAP or an ERP implementation, I should say, or a Salesforce implementation, or these things that are supposed to automate and create more connection with customers and stakeholders, we often have to add resources for a period of years around these technology implementations. So rather than fearing some of the shifts toward automation and technology, I think there's an opportunity for us as leaders to think about creating impact and meaning for all stakeholders, including employees. And when I watch what's happening societally today, I think about how we've disenfranchised large swaths of our society, both from a legal perspective with Black lives, and frankly, from a non-college educated sort of mid part of our country. What are we doing to adapt and to innovate how we work? Well, this is kind of what we're doing. We have developed different models. Obviously, some of these don't need to be explained, right? We're outsourcing to North Dakota a call center so that we don't have branches taking regular rudimentary types of customer calls. There's efficiency there. Okay, so we don't have to talk about a lot of these. What we're likely moving toward, everybody talks about this gig economy, this gig workforce, highly specialized people working in a micro way anywhere in the globe. Software developers in India providing very precise type of code writing for a pharmaceutical bioinformatics type of role. This is what we mean by gig workers. Where are they? They're all over the globe. They don't have to be here anymore. Just 5 years ago, Apple and Google were lobbying the government for more H-1B visas. They still are. But now we can find these gig workers all over the globe, anywhere. The geography doesn't matter. Think about Facebook, ghost workers. These are people that are literally people, not artificial intelligence, that are monitoring dangerous content on their site. They're working 24-hour shifts in what look like call centers. We call these ghost workers. They're actually humans flagging dangerous content, not machines yet. It's kind of a hybrid. As we think about the economy and the ways that we will provide a working environment in the future, think about me. I provide stand-up training and development, face-to-face executive coaching. It's going away. COVID has accelerated it, but it was going away anyway. We are going to have to manage in a very complex way a hybrid work environment. I don't think for many or most of us, we're going back to 9 to 5, Monday through Friday for all of our employees. Now, as I say that, you might be thinking, well, we never had that. And we kind of did. 10 years ago, it was the rare exception that we could take Friday afternoon off, or a single father or a single mother could leave at 3 to do childcare. That was like a special carve out. So let's be frank. We have had a working environment that was 9 to 5, pick your time, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, not that long ago. In that working environment, we had this top-down hierarchy way of organizing ourselves as companies. Very archaic, very old, command and control, all that. Serves a purpose, but it's very bland. Our working situation, our working environment was static. Now millennials come in, now COVID, now technology. We should be thinking about getting our head out of the sand and using the vaccine and the recovery of our society to put in place purposely and deliberately a hybrid work environment. Hybrid work environment allows flexibility, allows productivity, allows engagement when done thoughtfully and well. You'll hear people arguing, we've seen productivity go down as people have left the office. A, have you measured it empirically and accurately? Because I'm not sure that's altogether true. And 2, is it true in all cases for all job types? I think you see where I'm going. My point is, when we set up a hybrid working environment, we want to do it using criteria. We want to do it not just by using regulations and what I think I want or maybe we can provide. No, we want to use criteria. Criteria first, and we'll talk about the criteria in a moment, but we are not going back to 9 to 5, Monday through Friday for 90 to 100% of our workers. It's good. And if we think we are, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage, because whether you're a general contractor, an architectural firm, a software development firm, or a management consulting firm, my competitors are going to be offering flexible work environments, because when you poll millennials, about 98% want and need a flex and work environment and will forego pay to get it. And we're not hiring baby boomers in the future. Baby boomers are leaving the work. Millennials are coming into the work. My daughter's coming behind millennials in 5 or 8 years, and she doesn't even know from anything that's 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. She only knows from a hybrid. Here's the point of this webinar. There used to be a standard structure that came with it, expectations of perfection. And I'm coming to you saying, we're never going back there. At some level, for some reasons, competitive, demographically, technologically, the world being disrupted frequently, we are going to a hybrid environment. People need to be engaged and productive anywhere, regardless of physical location. Will we still use and need offices? Absolutely. We are social beings. Humans are social beings. Hybrid means just that. Hybrid means a combination of people who work both remotely and on site with others. And it's the same person. It's not just people, it's within me. Me, Michael Brainard, may come into the office from 11 to 4 for a meeting and to collaborate, and then go finish my real work or my individual work on my own time at any place. Some leaders saying I cannot do that would be constricting at this point. So rather than say cannot and constrain and constrict, let's deliberately and intentionally build our hybrid programs to create innovation and lead in this new way of thinking about the work environment. We need to get our head around this term hybrid. It's not just some people here, some people here. It's got to be driven by job type. It's got to be driven by leadership capabilities. It's got to be driven by what our customers in the marketplace want. There's multiple criteria by which to set up a hybrid environment. It is not just the laws, the labor laws around, do people get covered if they trip down their steps going downstairs to their home office? That's one piece of it. But deliberately, strategically, and intentionally thinking about how can I innovate my work environment as I've been in this unfrozen moment. Kurt Lewin talked about one of the greatest things we can do to create change is to work when there's an unfrozen or a broken moment. In that moment, now we have the opportunity to create a hybrid work environment. And it starts with strategically and deliberately thinking about that, and then preparing employees and leaders to work, to frankly thrive in that environment. All the while, remote work en masse absolutely can lead to problems. We are social beings. Being socially isolated can create anxiety and depression, lack of engagement, lack of opportunities for development. That's why I want to talk about the term hybrid. To isolate in a forced way is what the pandemic did. You may not come to the office for 40 hours a week. You may not have connectivity socially. Well, that went to the extreme. That was the unfrozen moment. And what we know is that curvilinear relationship. I'm going to say it again. With remote work, there's a curvilinear relationship that drives productivity and satisfaction. Just real quickly. With autonomy and me being in control of where, how, and when I work, productivity goes up, engagement goes up. Full stop, no debate. Curvilinear. When I get to some critical mass for me, for Joni, for Juan, for Sally, and I'm too isolated, I'm completely out of the office. Curvilinear in the hours out of the office. Now I'm out of the office 40 hours a week. What happens? My engagement can go down. My productivity can go down. Hybrid work environment. How do we prepare the work environment so that leaders and employees can have some level of autonomy, some level of control? This idea of control over how, when, and where I work, and this idea of autonomy, we know drives up engagement and productivity. We also know, going against the old myth, that when people are out of the office, they actually will work more hours. This isn't always a good thing, but this is one of the reasons productivity goes up. That old management myth that they'll work less if they're not around It's not true. There's been multiple studies that say people who spend 40 hours out of the office often work about 5 to 7 hours more than in-office employees. That's my own dissertation. Productivity and engagement go up with autonomy and control over when, how, and where I work. However, complete distance from an office, from a social situation, can have the negatives or downward effect. That's what we mean by curvilinear. As people have been socially isolated, their fears, their insecurities, their anxiety, sleep, depression, eating habits, we've had to be very mindful of these things. As people come back into a hybrid environment, we can use these learnings from the last year to really get down to the individual level, the team level, and the job type or function level when we set up our hybrid working environment. We can actually begin to use the DISC or Myers-Briggs or assessments to think about and help people gain insights and awareness around their need for social connectivity. My future wife, who I love very much, is a raging extrovert. She has to talk. She thinks out loud. She wants to engage. It's wonderful. She's a fantastic leader. Having said that, I'm a raging introvert. I don't need to talk. I like to think. I like the lights dim. I don't mind being alone. It actually turns me on. It excites me to be alone and have a lone working space. Neither are right. Different individual differences to get the most out of me from an engagement and productivity standpoint, to get the most out of that extrovert. We can get right down to the individual level, the team level, and then the function or job type to begin to set up our hybrid working environment. So let's think about that criteria. Before we think about what to do, I'd like to offer 3 or 4 criteria by which you would begin to answer key questions to set up your hybrid working environment. First, where are your customers and what do they need and expect? How can we acquire greater numbers of customers and delight the customers we have? The criteria for hybrid work has to start with our customer and market. Period, end of story. The second step is where in our operations can we gain efficiencies? Again, I'm going to say it, productivity and engagement. Engagement of customers and employees. But the second criteria is where can the hybrid environment impact negatively or positively productivity? So the first is our customers and markets. The second is our operations. Some of our operations can be greatly enhanced by a hybrid environment and some can be negatively enhanced. It's very hard to be productive as a nurse remotely. That's meant to be kind of a joke. You can't be, right? So where are the operational positive and negative impacts and how will they be expressed in a hybrid environment? Third, how do we think about meaningfulness or impact for all of our stakeholders with a hybrid environment? Employees, board members, vendors, suppliers, customers. Where is the value or the meaningfulness going to go away or go down or go up? We think about talent, we think about operations, and we think about meaningfulness or impact to our variety of stakeholders. And then we get to organizational structure based on job type, function, field versus corporate. We have people in construction every day during COVID who have been out on construction sites working in a group setting. Hasn't stopped. Some of us are afraid to go back to an office because we have different health conditions. Some of us have different individual types. So maybe that 4th and 5th criteria is understanding the type of work and the type of people. Then we get to work structure, then we get to compensation. And this is some of the 4 or 5 criteria we start with that intentionality to build the hybrid working environment. First, our customers. Second, our impact to operations. Third, the relative impact or meaningfulness to all of our stakeholders. How will the hybrid work environment negatively or positively impact? That's why I call these criteria. You can't just say one or the other. Let's set up the criteria and then go examine the impact that a hybrid working environment will give us. Then we can get into the specific types of hybrid when we look at job type, job function, and individual differences. What are we going to do? We're coming to the end of our time a little bit, and what do we want to do? We know the myth of perfection has existed in the traditional 9 to 5 office. It's an archetype of old leadership and old management. And I love when we sit in a workshop and we have people my age or older that can say, I remember when I was taught management theory X back in the 80s, that power and authority really was where you got your credibility, knowledge, mind, technical expertise. Not true. I love the world we live in now with Brene Brown talking about vulnerability, Daniel Goleman talking about emotional intelligence, talking about leadership that's flexible, that's supportive. As we come back from this socially isolated work environment that has been forced upon us, the next step now is, as leaders, creating intentionally and strategically the right kind of hybrid working environment for your organization. The criteria that I suggest we start with are service to customers and markets, impact to operations, and impact to the meaningfulness of the work for all stakeholders. I think if we can begin there, rather than OSHA or some legal and regulatory set of rules, we end with those. Now we get into the design and creation of the right hybrid working environment. And now what we have to do is put some quick behaviors in place, because we may not have time to intentionally design the right hybrid right away. And we shouldn't expect that it'll be perfect the right away or ever. Work environment is like compensation or performance plans. It's not going to be perfect for everybody. It's not expected to be. That's a myth anyway. How do we set up a structure and continuously improve that? Let's talk about some fundamentals real quick. There are 6 of them. 1, let's get away from this standard of texting and email. Let's have a technology forum that allows for asynchronous communications. We have employees in India. We have employees in Indiana. We have employees in London. We have to have a technology format that allows for people to seek information and give information on the time schedule they want to give it. Leaders can set micro expectations, but without being able to leave a note or leave a code or transmit some information in an asynchronous way, we're going to create frustration and anxiety. Why didn't they return my email? Why didn't they return my email? I stayed up till 1 in the morning because I thought they were starting at 9. Well, turns out they didn't start at 9. They started at 11 because they had a family situation. Asynchronous communication platforms and changing the expectations around communications. Number 2, leaders have to be prepared to lead differently. I just like to put this out there right now. We are developing 3 90-minute modules. Leaders are not prepared in traditional management and leadership development to lead a remote or hybrid workforce. This is a huge problem. You cannot lead hybrid employees using old standard traditional models. Work environment matters. The first module is going to be about them, the leader. What are your expectations? What are you bringing to the table when you have to manage people who aren't physically in front of you? What are you afraid of? What about you can you get insight around? Second module, what does it mean to be a hybrid employee? What do they expect? What do they need? How do we set goals? How do we reward? How do we create a team and collaborative environment? So first is the leader, him or herself. Secondly is what happens organizationally in a hybrid environment. And then third, what are the specific skills in 6 months, 3 to 6 months, that I have to get in place in terms of an action plan to evaluate and impact the meaningfulness of the work of the hybrid employees. Hybrid employees are the same me, Michael Brainard, I could be in the office Tuesday, out of the office Thursday, and it might be different next week. That's a hybrid. That work environment has to be created. It can't just exist by accident as we come back from social isolation. 1, asynchronous communication platforms. 2, leader preparation. 3, moving from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. We cannot be over-reliant on what we used to know. That's what's all over our media right now. People be holding to what they used to know. And so I said, maybe I was wrong. Maybe there wasn't mass fraud in the election. Maybe they weren't cheated. Maybe I wasn't wronged. Growth mindset says I'm constantly improving. I'm constantly saying I may be wrong. I need to learn more. I'm okay, but I'm okay with failure as well. Social networks. Number 4, As we go into a hybrid, we have to work harder. Humans are social animals. How does mentoring happen? How does collaboration off of the formal work happen? Creating in the network, in the organization, specific networks where people will be invited to connect. What about my development? Not training, but my actual access to really smart engineers. Social networks have to be actually deliberately created. They may exist on their own, but as an organization, let's be mindful and thoughtful. In review, asynchronous communications, leaders, 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 moving from a fixed mindset to an expectation that things are never perfect and you're a part of the solution for what's going to break. Fourth, deliberately creating social networks. Fifth, one of my colleagues at Forbes wrote a wonderful article that talks about excellence over perfection. Let's eliminate the word perfection. Let's think about excellence. Perfection is a myth and can never happen because it's always different. It's in the eye of the beholder anyway, even if it was something able. But we want to have an organization with excellence, with learning, with growth, with failure that can be leveraged. And then the sixth one I'd like to, just for me personally, those of you who know me, I can be a little passionate about this. Can we get rid of the 1-year goal setting and bonus cycle, please? I know it's convenient. I know that people in finance are rigid. I hear all the reasons to do this. The world doesn't exist in a 1-year plan from Jan 1 to December 31 anymore. How many people last January 1 would have predicted a global pandemic and the impact to our economy and our families? This goal setting, the way corporate America does performance reviews and goal setting on this annual cycle is nonsensical and it's arbitrary. As we move to a hybrid environment, let's think about a rolling 2 to 3 months, quarterly, even monthly series of sprints and goals and rewards that are aligned to a quarterly or even a monthly set of performance metrics. As leaders learn to remotely lead remote workers, they're going to have to be much more outcome oriented, as an example. We're not going to set a goal from now. Again, I'll reference my significant other. She's the COO of a large company. The corporation may have goals that will be attained by the end of the year, and the board would expect measurement on that. But you can't look at somebody named Kevin or Randy or Joan or Sally and say, hey, on December 31st, I'm going to hold you accountable for this thing that I'm setting today on January 30th. That's ridiculous. That's 11 months. Things get lost, things change. The sixth thing we have to do is go back to a hybrid environment, is challenge our goal cycle for teams and individuals and even corporations, challenge our planning cycling, and challenge our compensation. None of us want to do it because those things have been hardwired. But guess what? The work environment has changed from a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, quarterly outcomes, annual parties, and annual goals. We're moving much more in a rapid cycle around innovation, around technology, around artificial intelligence, and the world changes around us. So in summary, as we set up a hybrid environment, let's use criteria rather than convenience, or some senior executives guess at what it should look like. It should Sally be able to telecommute because of her job? No, let's establish the criteria for which we will build the hybrid working environment. When we do that, let's get some of these fundamentals in place. Let's challenge our compensation and goal setting. Let's begin to think about excellence, not perfection. Let's think about creating deliberately and intentionally social networks. Let's build a growth mindset into all that we do and verbally and behaviorally model that things will never be perfect. That's why we exist as employees and leaders. Let's train and prepare leaders to lead and drive productivity and engagement in a different work environment. And then finally, let's create asynchronous communication platforms so that people can communicate when, how, and as they need and want to, or their leaders need and want them to. That was quite a bit in 45 minutes. We're thinking a lot about the criteria to help organizations be intentional and strategic about setting up the new work environment. But to be clear, to want to go backwards, while we may want to go backwards, just think about the thought. We are not going backwards. It's not possible from a physics standpoint. We're not gone back to defined pension plans. Remember that? In the 70s, our fathers and grandfathers had defined pension plans from DuPont. They went away and were replaced with 401ks. not very innovative, but earth-shattering on how people plan for retirement. I would like to predict, and I think I'm right, we're not going back to in-office 9 to 5 for all employees all the time in all job types. Technology won't allow it, millennials won't allow it, and the world has been disrupted. Let's, instead of being afraid to want to go back, let's move forward. We're in an unfrozen moment, and let's get out in front and create this hybrid environment. Of course, there's things that all these articles and consulting firms suggest, like leader preparation, like org structure, but let's first be intentional about the kind of hybrid we want to create. Hopefully that was useful and you got an insight. Follow up with us at any time. Email me, email Elijah or Claudia. Love to come and be helpful to you. We'll start these webinars again in 2021. We'll have them quarterly. I think, Elijah, is that what we agreed to? And Q&A, please ask some questions.
All right. Looks like we have one question in, Michael. So with this hybrid environment, employers sourcing talent on a global level, will employers be hiring more offshore employees to replace in knowledge-based roles as happened with blue-collar production roles in the past?
I think so. I unfortunately, I think so. I'll go back here, this idea of gig work, crowd work, or even ghost work. We're seeing it already, right? I do think that outsourcing used to be this thing, right? You went and got a firm like Accenture and you put your call center in the Philippines and it was an entity. That's even going to be disrupted, right? This idea that we can get Elijah say, forget Elijah does X, Y, Z, and K. Well, Z and K could be done cheaper, more efficiently with greater productivity. Elijah, don't get mad. I'm using this as an illustration. By somebody sitting in London who's going to the London School of Economics and wants a part-time job, not a full-time job. Now, what we have to be careful about is obviously the downside of this. Employers using this to avoid providing benefits and other sorts of things to go to the bottom most rung to get productivity. That's why we think about our criteria. Remember, value, meaningfulness, and cost and efficiency. Meaningfulness has to be one of the criteria because I do not want America to lose its leadership position in how we treat our labor force. So it gets tricky and it's a long-winded answer, but there's no doubt that that can be used at the individual level as a micro form of outsourcing. That's what this gig work is all about.
Very good. Very good. We have another question. How would you suggest managing a hybrid environment with employees who have varied schedules? So that could be different hours, different days in the office versus at home.
My suggestion is let's change our mindset. Physically, where and when someone works, if it's critical to the job performance, then I think we have to consider it. But my first question would be, is their physical location or their hours of operating critical to job performance? Now, that's going to be a complex answer, right? People have to collaborate. People have to work with others who may not be around at different times. So now let's break it down further. Let's go back to Z, X, Y, and K. Z and X are fixed. You have to be Monday through Friday available between 1 and 4 West Coast time because that's when our colleagues are. But you know what, if I really think about that job at a micro, K and J, those parts of the job can be done anytime, anywhere. So as we purposely design the hybrid, as I mentioned, we not only have to get at the function and team level, we have to get at the individual level for that job to begin to be thoughtful about what parts cannot be moved off hours and what parts can be tolerated off hours. This is where it takes a little bit more thoughtfulness to build your hybrid strategy. You've got to get down to the job, not job description, but really the job analysis level and the individual difference level for some jobs, not all jobs, but some. Just a quick comment, job analysis is an old school thing that IO Psychologist does. It's boring, it's drudgery, but job analysis will be required going into the hybrid, not for all jobs, but for some jobs. There's an article called, an author called Gadke, G-A-T-K-E, Gadke and Fine, who wrote a marvelous book on how to do job analysis. And it gets right down to those individual components of productivity in any job.
Very good. We also have one more question regarding the. I'm trying to see the wording here. Yes. So sorry. Regarding measuring the how successful the hybrid environment can be, oftentimes productivity can take a while, or even team collaboration could take a while. How do you measure that in the short term if it's successful?
Well, I keep mentioning productivity engagement. At the end of the day, we have employees because we need productivity, and we want those employees to be motivated or engaged. So where we're not able to measure productivity, I'll mention one thing, but we can almost always measure engagement. Elijah, you might have worked with this new team just for a week. Well, I can give you 5 questions on an anonymous survey and ask you to rate your experience of working on that team. So let's start with engagement where we can't measure productivity. Okay, so that's one answer. The second part of the answer is think about productivity from a lagging indicator and a leading indicator standpoint. You're right, lagging indicators take time. Did you hit $1 million in sales? I don't know, I can't measure that till November. Okay, we do have leading indicators. How many sales calls did you make? How many sales email did you send? How many presentations did you do? How many proposals did you send? I can start to measure that weekly or monthly, salesforce.com, right? So think about productivity from a lagging indicator standpoint, but also a leading indicator standpoint, because as you set up a hybrid or remote workforce, you're going to have to set those leading and lagging indicators up anyway, and you can measure engagement much more quickly than productivity. So that would be my suggestion.
Cool. All right. Those seem to be the questions so far. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask before we end the webinar?
I'd like to say thank you. Elijah, I know we've recorded this webinar. We'll probably put it up on our YouTube channel, Elijah. I'm speaking for you right now. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to get the recording out.
Please email us if we can be helpful. We continue to research and put stuff together. We will be putting out a program on how to lead in a hybrid environment. I'm actually already kind of proud of it, just from the wireframe we've built. If you'd like to be an early entrant into that, go along with us. Love to learn and keep iterating. One more time, deliberately, intentionally setting up the hybrid environment. Start with your customer, get to your efficiencies and your product and service configurations. Don't forget the meaningfulness of work across all stakeholders. Thank you, everyone, and Happy New Year. Be safe in 2021.